The reason why we decided to have this one right now is because of the most recent conflict between the USA, Iran, and Israel. What's the most plausible worst case scenario if things get out of hand?
Iran has come close to developing a nuclear weapon. The missiles that Iran has, some of them fly at more than 10 times the speed of sound. Israelis have killed 10 times as many people in Iran as the Iranians have killed in Israel. A lot of them are civilians.
What I don't understand is how America just has constantly, it just keeps losing these wars that it keeps getting itself in, despite being the strongest country in the world. Why are they still not able to win?
Only the United States has the ordnance that can destroy those nuclear facilities that are on the surface or just under the surface. So whether they will actually do it or not, yesterday someone asked me what the probability is, and I said 90%. It is scary.
Is anyone anywhere safe? Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Guys, welcome back to the Righteous and Rich podcast. Today we have a very special guest with us, Professor Joel. Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Wa alaikum salam.
Interestingly enough, this is actually our second podcast, but when people see this discussion, this is actually going to be the first one that they see. So we've actually had an in-depth conversation about your journey, how you came to Islam, and all of your previous work. But you guys are going to have to watch out for that one, inshallah ta'ala, in the coming weeks. The reason why we decided to have this one, right now is because of the current climate in which we're living in right now, with the most recent conflict that has just begun between, this triangular kind of these three states, the USA, Iran, and Israel. And just to give you guys some context on Professor Joel, mashallah, tabarakallah, a very well-versed academic, mashallah, tabarakallah, who has worked on military strategy, the ethics of war, has been brought in by governments, politicians, military elites to develop military strategy and give them advice and counsel on what to do in these regards. And having accepted Islam since then, after 9/11, has written extensively on the Prophet ﷺ, his strategy, his military strategy, him as a leader. Amazing books, by the way. I thoroughly enjoyed. Thank you so much for your gift. Barakallah feek. Sheikh, I wanted to have this discussion because a lot of the times things are happening in the world and most people are not privy to them, especially Muslims. And in the past, we grew up just thinking there's an Illuminati and a new world order and this runs the world, but actually things are not as cryptic as that. And when you understand the world, sometimes it actually creates a lot of hope, because you can see exactly where things are going wrong and you can be hopeful for, how things can improve. You can also correct your own narratives inside of your home, amongst your spouse, your friends, people at work, because fundamentally these discussions they have a big impact on wider society. And now we have extreme leftists and extreme rightists, and these are all a consequence of conversations that have happened in real time in people's lives, right? And then they become the norm and becomes widespread. So this particular conflict is scary, because there's three nations that are involved, and if things go out of hand, it can have dire consequences for the world. So my first question, just to kind of demonstrate to people how serious the situation is, or could be, is if this goes wrong, what's the most plausible worst case scenario if things get out of hand?
Well, the fact that they've gone to war, the fact that Israel chose last Friday to attack Iran, tells me that it has gone wrong. Mm-hmm. It's already gone wrong.
Okay.
War should be a last resort. Mm-hmm. And it tells me that Israel's run out of ideas, and that's all that's left now. Mm-hmm. That diplomacy, for example, is no longer an option. So it has gone wrong. Now, going wrong doesn't mean it can't get worse. Mm-hmm. And so a likely worse would be a third party intervening. Mm-hmm. So let's say that, for example, America said Iran is on the canvas, it's weak, its air defenses have been mostly taken out by Israel, were never going to have a better chance than now to destroy its nuclear program, at least for a decade. They might feel, therefore, tempted to use air power to try to destroy the remnants of the...
And this is the USA you're talking about?
Mm-hmm, the nuclear facility. Only they can. Israel doesn't really have any ordnance big enough to destroy the Firdos.
And is this because their facilities are so deep underground?
Yeah, exactly. So Israel has degraded or perhaps even destroyed some of the nuclear facilities that are on the surface or just under the surface. And so they used F-35s, F-15s and F-16s. Each one carries 2 or 3 bombs, relatively small, but they have bombs that are capable of penetrating a few meters of hardened concrete. That's fine, except that Iran also has facilities that are deeply embedded, hundreds of meters beneath mountains. And only the United States has the ordnance that can destroy those. So it's likely that America will be looking and thinking, we're never going to have a better chance. So whether they will actually do it or not, who can say? Yesterday, someone asked me what the probability is, and I said 90%. 90% likely that America will use its B-2 Spirit bombers to carry these deeply penetrating bombs that they have.
Professor, what makes you say it's 90%? That's massive.
Well, it doesn't mean it's going to. There's still a 10% chance that it won't. Today, based on information in the public domain, I would say that's receded down to about 75%.
Okay.
Does the President Trump, really want to take his country to war only within 6 months of being elected, after winning a campaign on the basis of promises that, unlike his predecessors, he's not going to get America into these endless wars in the Middle East? Is he going to do that? Well, maybe not, but that's balanced against this very powerful narrative that Iran has come close to developing a nuclear weapon. And whether they have or not, who really knows? But they do have the ability to enrich uranium to a high degree, around 60%. Enrichment's a strange thing. Uranium has 3 isotopes, and one of the isotopes, uranium-235, is the isotope that you need to enrich at the expense of the others within the uranium itself to make it weapons capable in a nuclear weapon, for example. And you need to have about the enrichment to about 90%. But it's actually not too hard to go from 60% to 90%, and it doesn't take too long to do that. And by all accounts, Iran was at around 60% in enriching uranium to that level. And so America might say, on balance, no, we don't want to go into an endless war, so we won't. What we'll do is a limited set of airstrikes with the sole purpose of taking out those nuclear facilities that Israel can't take out. And then it's job done and we're out of there. The problem with that is that Israel has bases all over the Middle East. It has a lot of bases in Iraq and in Syria.
Israel or US?
The US, I beg your pardon. Sorry. Iraq and Syria, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, and even here in the UAE. And there's about 47,000 American troops stationed in the Arabian Gulf already. And it's also got a carrier group that's off the coast of Bahrain at the moment. And it's moving another one from the Indian Ocean to the Arabian Gulf. This might present Iran with a whole bunch of targets that it might feel compelled, if America does get involved, to take out. That's the worst case scenario. That's what you the phrase you use, worst case scenario. What works against that happening is that those countries that are in partnership with the United States, where bases are, for example, the UAE and Qatar, will obviously have been saying to the president, Mr. President, you may not launch a war from those bases, from within our sovereign territory. You can do it with your B-2 bombers from Diego Garcia or from carriers, from bases elsewhere, but not from here. Mm-hmm. And the Americans would probably respond positively to that and not do it from bases here, which means the likelihood of Iran striking the UAE, thankfully, is actually quite low. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there are less firm partnerships and relationships like Syria. America has been rather flexible and kind regarding the new leadership in Syria. Mm-hmm. But now it has bases there, and that's why it has, because it's got bases north of Israel, in Syria, northeast of Israel. And should something go wrong in Iraq, I beg your pardon, American forces in Syria or Iraq feel tempted to use weapons against Iran, Iran might see those as targets that it could direct weapons at, God forbid.
Just before we jump back into the podcast, I need to share something with you that's been weighing heavy on my heart for a few years. For years, you guys have asked me, is there a real way to make massive, passive wealth without touching riba? And truth be told, I didn't have a good answer for you. Most options available just seem like riba that's been rebranded as halal mortgages. And if the option is halal, then it's usually too risky, too scammy, or too slow. And then I came across Brother Sam Amin, who has $100 million of Muslim investor money invested in real estate. And this blew my mind. Here we have a guy who's helping people become multimillionaires through investing in real estate without riba. When I heard about it, I didn't jump on the opportunity straight away. I actually investigated it, and I observed the brother for over a year. I met his investors that have made millions on the back of investing with him. One of his investors actually is an uncle who had humble savings that now have compounded into $7 million plus, Allahumma barik, in just a few years. His deal structure is actually amazing. You enter into a joint venture with him and his team manage it 100%. Within 2 years, you're expected to receive a 50% return on your investment, Allahumma barik, and there's no haram. It honestly got really emotional for me because we now have a vehicle that doesn't compromise your deen, nor does it compromise your ambition. So that's why I felt compelled to share this good news with you. So look, if you're serious about wealth creation and you have at least $100,000 liquid ready to invest and deploy within 30 days, and you want your money to move, you want it to multiply without any haram, then Sam's newest development project here in Dubai might just be your ticket to generational wealth. Now, if this appeals to you, it's important that you know that over $5 million has already been committed to this fund. And this round is going to be closing very soon, inshallah. I've placed the link to apply to invest in his fund in the description of this video below. Alhamdulillah, this opportunity is real, and so is the window. With that said, let's get back into the podcast.
The other thing, of course, are the Straits of Hormuz. Not much American oil passes through the Straits of Hormuz. America doesn't get much oil from the Gulf anymore. It's moved away from that after Gulf War I. And it gets its oil from places like Nigeria and Venezuela. It's increased its own domestic production. But the rest of the world gets a huge amount of oil that comes through the Arabian Gulf, through the Straits of Hormuz. And it's a narrow waterway that could easily be interdicted and cut by Iran if Iran felt the need to apply some type of punitive measures against, say, American shipping or other shipping. And for countries that have a heavy reliance on Gulf oil, that's a worst case scenario, the severing of the Straits of Hormuz. But I don't think Iran is even close to those options at the moment. At the moment, it's doing okay with its ballistic missiles. On the first day, which was last Friday, when it was attacked by Israel, it sent a wave of drones and missiles against Israel. And the drones, if you ride a motorcycle, you'll ride it faster, certainly on the motorway, than those Shahad drones fly. They fly well under 200 kilometers per hour. They take, 7-8 hours to fly from Iran to Israel.
Oh, wow.
So, at 100 miles per hour, 160 kilometers per hour, it's a long journey, 1,400 kilometers. So between 7 and 9 hours of flight. And they're an easily detected target, easy to shoot down. Drones aren't designed for that particular mission. The drones that they use in Ukraine, for example, that the Russians and the Ukrainians use, they're using those at close range against troops on the ground. They'll fly them up, detect and drop their ordnance on vehicles or on personnel, flying over flat desert spaces at a very slow speed means most of those are going to get shot down and have been. But the ballistic missiles seem to be getting through, at least some of them. And even if only 10% of Iran's missiles are getting through to Israel, even if it is that, and I suspect it's probably around 20%, if you fire a wave of missiles, and on the first day there were between 200 and 300 missiles, that's still 20 or 30 that are getting through. Now, a missile doesn't have a big warhead. It's the equivalent of 2 bombs dropped by a fighter interceptor, for example, or a fighter bomber like a F-35. It's not a heavy payload, but psychologically it's significant.
Yeah.
Israel has claimed that its Iron Dome will stop anything getting through. And it mostly stopped Hezbollah missiles and rockets, and Hamas missiles and rockets, and drones, because they're crude and unsophisticated and fly slow. But the missiles that Iran has, including these intercontinental ballistic missiles and others, they are enormously fast. Some of them fly at more than 10 times the speed of sound. Speed of sound is over 1,200 kilometers, 767 miles per hour.
Wow.
10 times that. That's around 7,000 miles per hour. They fly them up. So a ballistic missile is
so within less than an hour it can get there?
Is what, sorry?
So it can get from Iran to Israel in less than an hour?
In about 14 minutes.
Wow.
About 14 minutes. When you think back to the time of Saddam Hussein with what were called Scud missiles, they were effectively fire and forget. You couldn't navigate them, at least terribly well. And they had a big signature. The missiles that Iran has, they have hypersonic missiles, for example, that fly very, very fast, and they are maneuverable. You can maneuver them. So instead of predicting a straight flight path, they fly irregular flight paths, hard to shoot down.
That's intentional.
And then they'll have a warhead. Some of them have a single warhead. Others will have a warhead that opens and releases 3, 4, 5, or a cluster of warheads. And shooting all of those down is beyond the capacity of the Israeli Iron Dome. So we see a lot of damage being done within Israel. And I think that's caught them by surprise.
They weren't expecting it, you think?
I don't think that degree of retaliation. Israel did a fabulous job of, if that's the right word, of negating, degrading the Iranian air defense system. So these are weapons that are designed to shoot down aircraft, surface-to-air missiles. F-35s will fly over. The idea is that you'll try and shoot them down. An F-35 is a fifth-generation aircraft that has a very low radar visibility, about the size of a flying golf ball. So you imagine a golf ball, something this big, flying either supersonic or slightly below the speed of sound on an Iranian radar. It looks like a bird. It's no bigger than the signature of a bird.
These are the jets that Israel has.
But they don't have many of them.
Israel doesn't have many of them.
So they have greater numbers of F-15s and F-16s, which are a previous generation to the F-35s. They have a lot of those, hundreds of them. But they have something like 29 F-35s. And Iran claims to have shot down 5 of these. I personally doubt it. I've seen all the fake photographs of them shot down. I mean, they're clearly fakes. But the problem with them is they're so high technology in F-35 that you can't continuously fly them day in and day out. They have an enormous issue with what's called readiness rates. You have to maintain them, service them, take out the engines after a certain number of air knots and so on. And so I think they're going to quickly run out of the capacity to keep the F-35s above Iran, which means they'll be reliant on F-15s and F-16s, which are more easy to target than F-35s. They're using them already, but it's the F-35s that are almost invisible and getting through and destroying things, including a lot of surface-to-air missiles. But those don't matter so much in that sense. The mobile batteries that Iran has for firing missiles into Israel.
So just to confirm, these mobile batteries are the vehicles from which they launch these missiles?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you'll have a tunnel inside a hillside. They will drive them out somewhere where they can aim them. The missiles stand upright. They fire them off towards Israel, and they quickly get the truck back
into the tunnel.
Inside the tunnel.
Okay.
Israel's done a pretty good job at destroying some of them, no doubt about it. But Iran has a lot of them. But a lot only means less than, say, 3,000 or 4,000 total. And they've already used as many as perhaps 700. So
of the missiles.
So this can't go on forever unless Iran is supplied from outside.
Can't they just make more?
They can make more as long as the factories where they make them haven't been hit. And Israel's trying to make sure that it destroys those factories.
Okay.
But a lot of those factories are inside hillsides as well.
As well, okay.
If Iran is able to convince friends to supply it with parts or even complete missiles, it may be able to continue fighting longer. But at the rate that it could produce them, it will reach the end sometime. And it doesn't have anything else that it can use directly to threaten Israel. On the other hand, Israel has a small number of aircraft that it has to keep airworthy every day, flying over Iran. And that's exhausting for the aircrew, for the pilots themselves. It's a long flight, about 1,400 kilometers from Israel. You have to go out over Syria in a big arc. And then to carry out your missions, you may be over Iran for an hour, maybe 2 hours before you fly home. It's absolutely exhausting for the pilot in the aircraft. Now, they have a lot of pilots and they're rotating them, I'm sure. But the aircraft, they have a finite number of those. And so even an F-35 has to, after a certain number of flights, be taken out of operations and maintained and serviced. And sometimes they have to do complete engine rebuilds and so on. So Israel can't sustain those levels of air attacks either. But at the moment, Israel seems to have what's called air superiority over central Iran and is doing pretty much what it wants. On the other hand, Iran has proven that the much touted Iron Dome that Israel has isn't completely impenetrable. They're doing...
Professor, at the same time, the way Iran's missile supply would be limited, then surely these counter-strike missiles that are used in the airdrome are also going to be limited.
You mean the Israeli ones?
Israeli ones, yeah.
Right. That's my point, is that both sides will wear down their ability to continue operations on this scale and intensity pretty quickly. And at one point, Israel was flying a lot of missions over Iran. They're flying fewer.
Now, okay.
And Iran likewise is firing fewer missiles. They fired 6 or more waves of missiles within the first day or two. And that was incredibly powerful. And Israel was overwhelmed in those early days and shooting down far fewer than it wanted to. And Israel sustained more damage than it has in any war since, 1973. And I think for Muslims around the world who have watched the suffering of Gaza, there's a sense of kind of euphoria when they see a Mossad tower building on fire, or they'll see Israeli apartment buildings with a big hole in the side and people suffering. And we think, well, that's payback for Gaza, and that's payback for this or payback for that. And I understand that sentiment. On the other hand, we have to hold ourselves to a high standard as Muslims when it comes to, for example, deaths among civilians. We don't hate Jews because they're Jews. We don't hate any race as Muslims. The state of Israel is different even than the people of Israel. And we can hate the state of Israel all we want. We can hate, for example, even political Zionism. We can't hate Jews because they're Jews, or even Israeli people because they're Israelis. And the idea that we would somehow glory in their suffering, we have to just be careful of that, just to hold ourselves in check. And I see a lot of dialogue on social media about this, where people have this triumphalist spirit that they finally see a street in Tel Aviv all knocked down, for example, all the buildings. And I understand it. But as I said, we just have to hold ourselves to a high standard when it comes to the morality of war. The Islamic tradition has a clear distinction between those you can harm in war and those you can't harm in war. And civilians are off limits, not only in the Islamic tradition, but in the Western tradition and in international humanitarian law. So just something I think I caution any viewers who are feeling excited that finally it's kind of a sense of payback that I understand that. We just have to hold ourselves in check when we know it's civilians that are suffering, even on their side. But at the moment, it's disproportionate. The Israelis have killed maybe 7, 8, 10 times as many people in Iran as the Iranians have killed in Israel. It might be as much as 10 to 1 at the moment.
Okay.
And that, again, is tremendously lamentable. A lot of them are civilians. Since, I don't know when, at least since 2003, the war on Iraq, and 2001, before that, the war in Afghanistan, something like 85% of all the people who die in war are civilians, and only 15% are combatants. And it's a strange thing to discuss because the 20th century involved a very powerful move among states to make war humane. We had the Convention on Genocide 1948. We had a whole bunch of new laws introduced into the Geneva Conventions of 1949, additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions in 1977, all with the aim of minimizing the harm of war, especially to civilians. And yet throughout that period, from the mid-years of the 20th century through to now, the ratio of civilians to combatants has increased, not decreased.
Is this intentional, Professor, or is this just like bad execution of military strategy?
It's a bit of both. It's
because one thing I've never understood is, like, with the degree of precision that they have in terms of this new weapons technology, why are they not able to just target the combatant on either side?
Well, theoretically you can. if you mean the use of air power. So, for example, let's say you happen to be a high-ranking Iranian military officer, and the Mossad have identified where you are, that you're going to be in this apartment building, in that apartment, at this time. They can put a small piece of ordnance that's about the size of a tennis ball through the window of that apartment and kill just that person.
And this would be like a drone?
No, it would be a small navigatable bomblet, something not much bigger than this glass, for example.
How would they get it in there? In the country?
Well, one thing we know from what Ukraine did in Russia, taking out some of the Russian strategic bombers, is that you can get things, ordnance, into other people's country, no matter how tight the security is. We know that. Israelis have assassinated between 10 and 20 military officers and a whole stack of nuclear scientists with Mossad operatives inside.
To be spies?
Spies and special forces that are operating drones.
From within enemy lines.
Mm-hmm. So in the old days, that was, you needed to have someone in to be able to have a precision-guided munition. Normally what you had was you'd have to get someone up close and to scope the target and then lock it in manually. That now is all done by GPS. So most things, for example, if you know that in this particular part of Tel Aviv, there's this government building, we can even see that on Google Earth and it'll even be identified as to what it is on Google Earth and Google Maps. That means that anybody can hit anything with a degree of precision.
Yes, so this is very scary.
It is scary.
Is anyone anywhere safe then?
Well, it depends on who you mean. Say from whom. Most countries do comply with the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, for example, the Hague Conventions. Most countries do. There's 195 countries at the moment that are member states of the United Nations. And if you count up violations of the Geneva Conventions at the moment, you find out that right as we speak, there may be no more than 6 or 7 countries right now violating the Geneva Conventions out of a total of 195.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, in those 5 or 6 countries, the violations are egregious.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty outrageous.
Is that because the other countries haven't been faced with the scenario of possibly violating them, and that's why they happen?
No, I think there's a general understanding that laws are good to have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot about my tendency to speed. I'm a bit of a fast driver.
Mm-hmm.
There's a speeding rule in this country, as in every country, on the roads for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it's a necessary way of keeping people from dying in large numbers in crashes. So there's a reason. But there are always some people who will just break the law.
Mm-hmm.
But if you break the law, you're likely to get caught if you speed, especially a lot. With international humanitarian law and you break it, it's very hard to be put in front of a court for it.
Right.
It's very difficult. You know, we have the International Criminal Court, which has existed for just over 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
But to charge somebody with a crime under the Rome Statute, which is the law that governs the International Criminal Court, the perpetrator has to be from one of the parties to the treaty, to the Rome Treaty, the Rome Statute. Well, is Iran a party to the Rome Statute? No, it's not. Is Israel? No, it's not. Is America? No, it's not. Is Russia? No, it's not. So you can see that in the wars that we have at the moment, you have countries who have said, we don't agree with the International Criminal Court. How dare you think that any of our citizens are going to be ever brought before that court? So if they haven't signed and ratified it, they're not bound by it. And unless they commit their crimes inside a country that has signed and ratified it, they're immune from prosecution anyway. Mm-hmm. So the chances of, let's say, Israel being accused of a war crime and presenting its leader or leaders to the international court, and that's the process that has to happen, is pretty much nil. The same with the United States. The United States, there's a lot of criticism of the United States as the world's policeman. And I've often thought that's an odd thing to criticize a country for. If the world needs a policeman, if it does, who would you rather have than the United States as the policeman? China? India? Who? The more fundamental question is, should any country be the world's policeman? And the answer is, in a world with the United Nations, we have a policeman. The United Nations is supposed to be that organization that keeps the world safe. Mm-hmm. And I'm a great fan of the United Nations. United Nations does more in terms of public health, the minimization of things like sexual slavery and human trafficking. It does wonders in terms of literacy rates around the world. All of those sorts of things, care of the environment. But in terms of the world security, the United Nations hasn't brought great results. So it isn't able to fulfill that role as the world's policeman. And the International Criminal Court anyway is separate from the United Nations. It wasn't created by the United Nations, which has its own International Court of Justice. It can send people. The Security Council can make a recommendation that this particular leader on the surface appears to have committed that war crime, and the Security Council can make a recommendation to the International Criminal Court to open a prosecution, for example. But it's not enforceable in a way that you would understand. Mm-hmm. The International Criminal Court is set up to be what's called a complementary court. The first court, or the first course of redress, is supposed to be national courts. So let's say that there's a country that's been to war and it identifies that its own people have committed war crimes. The idea is they're supposed to try their citizens in their own national courts, mm-hmm. and the International Criminal Court will only try them if the national courts have refused to, mm-hmm. or don't do. So there's a kind of a strange problem with the International Criminal Court. So there's both a positive and a negative. The positive is that most countries do comply with the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law.
Are they bound by them?
Only if they've... Well, yeah, actually, there's a phrase in Latin, jus cogens, which means that the world identifies the Hague and Geneva Conventions as customary law, which is binding on everyone. Mm-hmm. So even if you don't sign and ratify the Geneva Conventions, you're still bound by them. On the other hand, prosecuting someone through the International Criminal Court, as I mentioned, that's only binding upon people within a country that have either committed the crime inside a territory that signed and ratified it, or that person himself belongs to a country that signed and ratified it. Mm-hmm. And lots of countries haven't, mm-hmm. including the ones that are fighting at the moment in those wars. So we see Israel and America and Iran, none of them have signed and ratified the Rome Statute for the International criminal court. So the likelihood that anyone's going to be prosecuted for these is pretty much nil. Ukraine this year, finally, because it thinks there's a good chance that Putin might one day end up in the dock, has signed and ratified the Rome Statute, but Russia hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the idea that we would see Russian leaders in the dock, or Ukrainian, or Israeli, or Iranian, is pretty much nil.
Mm-hmm.
And that's concerning to a lot of people, obviously. The good news I go back to is that it's better to have laws that most people follow,
Mm-hmm.
even if some don't, than to have no laws and no standards
Mm-hmm.
at all. So I'm comforted by the fact that throughout the 20th century, humans worked really hard after the horrors of the First World War and the Second World War to try and minimize the violence of war, the harm
Mm-hmm.
of war. My disappointment, as much as I'm enormously respectful of that attempt to minimize harm, is that wars are still occurring and that the percentage of civilians dying in them hasn't decreased, in fact, has grown to about 85%.
Mm-hmm.
During the Second World War, this is where it all started. Second World War, 60 million people died in 6 years, 10 million a year, about 27,000 a day, of which 2/3 were civilians or non-combatants. And it's gone from about 60% 85 years ago now to about 85%. And part of it is because the human population is now so big. You know, we're up over 8 billion humans, and militaries fight from where their people are. Why? Because their people are everywhere. There aren't these great empty areas and lands where humans don't live now.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at somewhere like Germany, for example, Germany has a village every 2.5 kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
In any direction, you just walk in any direction, you'll come to the next village.
Mm-hmm.
That's how congested the land is. Now, you might say, well, Iran has empty areas, deserts, and so on. Afghanistan does. Sure, that's true. But in the areas where people do live, it's immensely congested. And what that means is that that's where the warfare happens, because that's where the people are.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very hard to separate out combatants from non-combatants anymore.
Mm-hmm.
In the old days, the army would march out into kind of an empty area away from the towns.
They would fight there.
Mm-hmm. And there'd be a battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
You'd call it a battlefield. And the other side would send its troops out. And two lines of soldiers would attack each other. It would be brutal and lots of death. But they would all be combatants. And the local townsfolk would ordinarily be spared. Maybe the soldiers had plundered their farms and taken all their crops or whatever. That's the worst thing that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Now war happens where people are.
Mm-hmm.
And people now are everywhere. So wars are now happening in and around cities and towns instead of in the empty parts of the countryside.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to do anything about that.
Mm-hmm.
So you look, for example, at Gaza. Where does Hamas fight back against the Israelis from? The answer is from within those congested urban areas where the non-Hamas Gazans are. And it's very, very hard to separate people out. The Taliban in Afghanistan, it was a difficulty for Western troops fighting in Afghanistan to work out who was Taliban and who wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
who was therefore a legitimate target of war and who wasn't. Because they looked like the ordinary citizens. They dressed the same. They weren't in uniform. And so the need to discriminate and say, that's a civilian, I cannot take that person's life, became much more problematic. You can't tell who's a civilian in today's world, in today's wars. It's perhaps clearer with Ukraine and Russia. They have national uniforms with on their shoulder, their nation. It will say Ukraine on one shoulder, and the Russians say Russia. But even they are still fighting from within areas where Ukrainian ordinary citizens are living and trying to survive. It's not possible to just flee. So you take Tehran. Tehran is a country, Iran is a country of about 90 million, of which 10 million live in Tehran. 10 million people. And there's ordnance falling there in that city now, every day now for, 8 days. Where are those 10 million people going to go? And you've seen that some are trying to get out. And you imagine if you're, say, a father with young kids, you're thinking, my God, there's missiles coming down or bombs from aircraft. We're out of here. But where do you go? Where do you flee to? How do you flee? And you see that those roads are so congested. The other thing about it, though, I have to say, is that bombing is initially terrifying and people get shocked by what's happening around them. But aerial bombardment has a strange psychological aspect to it. The aircraft are far above all the missiles coming down are from remote places. You don't see the enemy to fear the enemy in that sense. So bombs fall, destroy something. After a while, life goes on. And what tends to happen is the people that are under bombardment get not used to it, but to a degree they do.
I've seen videos where, for example, a bomb will drop in somewhere in Gaza. They'll stop upon impact. Everyone looks, and then it's over. Just carry on walking.
Take, for example, the worst battle in human history. I wrote a book on this nearly 30 years ago now, called The Battle of Stalingrad. In one city, I don't know, between 1 and 2 million people died in this battle.
Which country is this in?
This was in Russia, in southern Russia, in World War II. On one day, the 23rd of August, 1942, the German Luftwaffe flew its biggest ever day of missions against a single target, against the city of Stalingrad. For a whole day, they just bombed it and bombed it and bombed it and bombed it. And they bombed the factory areas where the Red Army tanks, T-34s and so on, were being made, and where Red Army uniforms were being made. Well, production of tanks and uniforms slowed down for a few days. What happened was they moved their machines and their tools down underground, and production went back to normal. And the Germans were shocked by it and thought, how can they survive under our bombs? How can they? And what it did is it's strengthened the resolve of these ordinary civilians to fight on. The injustice of being bombed from the air united the people. And we think, well, Netanyahu's getting a taste of his own medicine. He hasn't even been a popular prime minister in recent years. He's been a long-serving one. He's done 17 years in total as prime minister of Israel. But he was recently close to his coalition collapsing. But what's happened is the Israelis are now uniting because they are under the Iranian missiles, and they're uniting in the same way the British did during the Blitz by the Germans on London and Coventry and Birmingham and so on. Likewise, what they call the regime, which is a pejorative phrase to denigrate Iran, the government of Iran is finding that its people are throwing their support behind them. Even though recently there were mass demonstrations against what they called human rights violations and so on. They're now being bombed by Israel, and the Iranians are saying, we're Iranian, we're united. We can't have these people bomb us in this fashion, and we stand with our government. So isn't that an irony that this type of violence brings out some type of strengthening of the human character rather than a breaking of their will? So it's a scary war to watch. I'm unsure what's going to happen next. As I said, I've strongly believed that America would intervene. Now, a lot of people ask me, are Netanyahu and Trump in cahoots? Is there a conspiracy? Did they have this all agreed in advance? And the answer may be yes, but it also may be no, Israel just went ahead and did it and is now, in a sense, forcing the hand of the Americans. The Americans have a carrier group in the Arabian Gulf. They're already shooting down, the Americans are shooting down Iranian missiles. And they have, in the Mediterranean coast of Israel, missile destroyers that are likewise. So they are already helping. But what we'll see is whether President Trump will take that step and say, we're never going to have a better chance than now to destroy once and for all Iran's nuclear ambitions. Mm-hmm. I'm still leaning towards yes, he will.
Before we jump back into the podcast, I need to share something with you that changed everything for me. Last year was one of the hardest years of my life. My health was at an all-time low. I had constant fatigue, brain fog, massive weight gain. My marriage, it was the hardest year of my married life. My business, I had setback after setback. Even my salah was suffering due to the lack of khushu' and my seeking knowledge. I was in a terrible place until I sat down with the Muslim entrepreneur coach on this podcast, namely Brother Fawaz. And he made a bold claim. He said, I help Muslim entrepreneurs make 10x more money whilst working 4 times less, at the same time showing them how to thrive in their marriages, in their health, and in their religion. Truth be told, it was a bold claim. I wasn't entirely convinced, but what's a man to do when he's desperate? I needed a solution. So I joined his Live by Design mentorship. And I can swear to you by Allah, it changed everything for me with Allah's permission. I am now making more money than ever before. I am also working less. In fact, I work very few hours, but the Live by Design program has showed me how I can get a week's worth of work done in just a few hours every single day. I feel healthier than ever before. I'm turning up better than ever before. My family is happy with me. And my salah is back. And my seeking of knowledge is thriving with Allah's permission. And just to be clear, I'm not the only one. One of Fawaz's mentees on his program was making just 13K a month while struggling in his life. Just 6 months later is doing $500,000 a month. Allah Mabarak. So here's the truth. If you're a Muslim entrepreneur that's making at least 100K every year, but you know that you're operating far from your actual potential and these other areas of your life that are very important are struggling, then Fawaz's Live by Design mentorship might just be the thing for you. But please be warned. It's not easy, nor is it cheap. But if you're ready to live a life that you design with Allah's permission, then check out the link below in the description of this video. This is the program that changed my life with Allah's permission. And it might just change yours as well, inshallah. With that said, let's get back into the podcast. But if he does, what would be the consequence of taking such action?
Well, in terms
I wonder, could this spark civil unrest within America? Because it seems like the majority of people are against this interventionist approach.
Well, intervention started really with the liberal democracies about 20-something years ago. There was a constellation of liberal politicians in the West. There was Bill Clinton in America and Tony Blair in Britain simultaneously. And they saw that something bad was happening. Milosevic in Serbia isn't giving freedom to the Kosovars, and he's waging a counterinsurgency against the Kosovo Liberation Army. We can't have that. So they went to war and bombed Serbia for 78 days. As you'll remember, they decided that it would be much better if Saddam was no longer president of Iraq. Mm-hmm. And on the basis of a claim that this was morally necessary or morally good, they intervened against Saddam, alleging weapons of mass destruction, which is kind of ironic given the current situation with the claims against Iran. And that set a kind of a precedent in some ways. These early liberal Western moral interventions, as they were called.
So they see themselves as heroes?
Well, I think they see themselves as somehow kind of like liberators, that democracy is a universal good. Democracy is good for everyone everywhere, not just for Western states, but for people everywhere. And that we're doing the world a lot of good if we get rid of dictators and create the framework for democracy in these countries. Like Libya,
they saw themselves as evangelists for the cause.
It's the nature of ideology. So if you're a Marxist or a communist, let's say you're Joseph Stalin, you believe that Marxism isn't just good for Russians or for Europeans. You believe it's good for humans everywhere. So you'll support communist movements in other countries who are aspiring to bring about the same kind of change as you are. Democracy is one of those types of ideologies as well. You can't be a Democrat and say, well, I believe democracy is good for British people, but I don't care if Egyptians have it or not. If you believe it's good for your people, it's the nature of ideology, you believe it's good for people everywhere. And so they get this thing in their head where they genuinely believe that the greatest good right now would be get rid of that guy and build within that state a framework for democracy that people will want it and they will grab it. And within a year or two or three, it will somehow become organic and natural for them to be democratic. And what we found with Afghanistan, and especially with Iraq, is that that's not the case. Democracy is it's a kind of a culturally or civilizationally specific type of ideology. And large parts of the world haven't seen it as their natural form of governance. And trying to kind of not impose it by force, but break the state so that the only thing they can do is to rebuild it in a democratic model, it didn't work. And it led to things like the rise of Daesh, because all we did was we created these power vacuums. And you think about poor old America and its coalition, went to war in Afghanistan for about 20 years, spent well over $1 trillion to fight it. Fight who? The Taliban. Who did they leave in charge when they left? The Taliban again. So what was that 20 years for? That democratic experiment didn't work. It was an alien philosophy that was kind of imposed upon the people of Afghanistan. And who knows, they may find their way towards a democratic future. But I suspect it's unlikely. And so, the world wasn't designed to be this way. Since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, there's been a view that states are sovereign. And sovereignty basically means that within its borders, and borders are a major part of the Westphalian system,
they can do what they want.
A state can do what it wants, as long as, for example, it doesn't violate the rights of the people in the countries around about it. And then things like Rwanda happened, where you had Hutus and Tutsis, in this bloody, violent
civil war
that caused, I'm not sure, 900,000 or 1 million deaths. And the world knew it was happening, and there were even United Nations peacekeepers seeing it happen, and they didn't intervene to stop it. And so I think those sorts of things, ethnic cleansing of Kosovars and others in Yugoslavia, Bosnian Muslims included, I think it created this sense that we can't let injustice occur, we have to intervene. And that's probably where this moral interventionism grew from. But it hasn't worked. You can't impose structures and ideologies on people. They have to find them for themselves or not at all.
So I understand the concept of not being able to, as in people won't adopt an ideology which is like a belief that comes from within, right? Purely by being forced. You can put a gun to someone's head, he'll comply physically, but internally, the moment the gun's gone, he's gone back to his normal ways. What I don't understand is how America just has constantly it just keeps losing these wars that it keeps getting itself in, despite being the strongest country in the world in terms of the most sophisticated weapons technology, intelligence, so on and so forth. Why are they still not able to win?
I think it's because winning is really difficult.
Can we define winning first then?
Well, before the Second World War, winning normally meant that you would use your military force to coerce another state to reach some type of agreement on their behavior.
Agreement
on their behavior.
On their behavior, okay.
The Second World War was the first time Western states demanded what's called unconditional surrender. So in the mid-years of the Second World War, President Eisenhower and Prime Minister Churchill met in North Africa to decide the second half of the war. And the Americans came out with this phrase, we demand nothing less than the total and unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. It actually caught Churchill by surprise. And he thought, that gives us one option only, which is we've got to keep going now until they surrender. It gives the Germans no option but to fight on because now negotiation is impossible. There cannot be now a negotiated settlement unless it's just a total capitulation, which is unlikely. So we've tended to shy away from wanting to totally defeat the enemy. And we've tried to kind of find ways of finding a settlement that's less than that, but still acceptable politically. I'm very surprised that President Trump has used this phrase. He threw it out there as if it was a casual phrase, unconditional surrender. We expect Iran's unconditional surrender. That really wasn't the wisest thing to say because it means all other diplomatic outcomes
have
just been taken off the table. He's probably trying to row himself back from that. It wasn't the wisest thing to say. But it's been said, and the Iranians have heard it. The world has heard it. And it's unlikely that they're going to simply give up. States don't do that. The only way that would happen would be if there was a war involving, a popular phrase is boots on the ground. Putting troops into Iraq, American and coalition troops, twice now, Gulf War I and Gulf War II, was far easier than it would be to do that in Iran. Iraq is effectively a flat plain. And once you've got people ashore, let's call it in Kuwait, you just march across this flat plain towards Baghdad. Iran, if you look at an Iranian map, you'll see that it's, at least on three sides of Iran, ringed by very, very high and difficult mountain ranges, and that it has large areas of effectively uncrossable desert as well. Invading Iran, a country of 90 million people with a very, very strong ground military capability, isn't, I don't think, a realistic option. So if it's not boots on the ground, what else is there? Well, there's things like political sanctions and economic coercion, or there's air power. And America has immense air power. It has almost 50% of all the military aircraft in the world, the US alone. And at one point it was 50%, a full 50% of all the military aircraft in the world belong to one country. America has 11 carriers. I think 11 at the moment, carrier groups. And a carrier, an aircraft carrier that flies its own aircraft, it's not a carrier that sails by itself. It has...
These are like naval vessels?
Naval vessels. Mm-hmm. They have a fleet. Mm-hmm. And so you'll have an aircraft carrier that has missile destroyers and a whole range of other vessels around it, including submarines. And above it, it is continuously patrolled in the air by aircraft. It is an immensely powerful thing. And as I said to you, there's one that's moving. There's two that are going to be used, God forbid, if this goes ahead and the Americans do intervene. And they'll both be moved into the Arabian Gulf. They can fly missions continuously from those, and long-range bombers like the B-2 and the B-52 can fly from thousands and thousands of kilometers away. And they can refuel with tankers, and they've moved dozens of tankers, even from Britain, from British American airfields. These are air-to-air refuelers that will refuel fighters and other aircraft.
In midair?
In midair, without landing. But so what? What can you do with that? The answer is you can bomb lots of stuff and break lots of things, but you can't change regime from the air. You can't occupy a country and control it in an old-fashioned sense. So it's a very difficult scenario emerging.
As in, you have to have boots on the ground. And you think it's just not plausible for them to have boots on the ground in a country like Iran due to the geographical landscape?
It's got an immense military capacity in terms of moving people on the ground, Iran. Now, that's deadly if you've got the Americans or the Israelis with air superiority. But you've got ordinary Iranians who aren't going to let invaders in their land without a resistance.
Yeah.
And a resistance in military terms, we call that an insurgency. Mm-hmm. And even if, for whatever, the supreme leader and his government collapsed and the Americans thought, great, we've done it. What have you done? That leadership will be replaced by something else.
Probably more radical.
More radical, that you can't control. Mm-hmm. And so unless you're going to be there with boots on the ground, an air campaign alone isn't going to bring any strategic outcome of any great worth. So I think that's actually off the table. So
the boots on the ground.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And even a long air campaign, as you said, America hasn't done great with wars. When President Bush sent the Americans into Iraq in 2003, it was over quickly in terms of the conventional battle. But the unconventional battle, the insurgency then rose up, and the Americans were held there and suffered horrendous losses.
Who led the insurgency there?
Well, there were different insurgencies led by different groups in different provinces of Iraq.
Right. As in they just wanted the Americans out?
Just wanted the Americans.
They weren't like Saddam supporters or anything like that?
Some of them were.
Okay.
Saddam had supporters. He wasn't hated by everyone. And this is the likely kind of history repeats itself scenario if Americans were to try and do that with Iran. It's just not viable. Mm-hmm. So the options are a very limited air campaign focused on destroying
the nuclear facilities.
The nuclear facilities that are underground, or a sustained air campaign to do what?
As much damage as possible.
The problem with that is if they take that second course, Iran isn't going to just sit by idly. It will say, we have to defend ourselves and we have to make them hurt for this. And so sealing off the Straits of Hormuz is a possibility, God forbid. Terrorist attacks all over the place would be a likely scenario. And strikes on American bases were outside of the territories of their friends. So as I mentioned, the UAE and Qatar and other places like that do have American troops. There's 3,000 500 or so in the UAE. I'm not sure, about 10,000 in Qatar and other places. They're probably not going to go after them, even if this got bad.
Mm-hmm.
But Americans in Syria and Americans in Iraq, for example, would be fair game. And I hope President Trump's advisors are telling him that.
If they were to do that, then, but what you're saying is that the most that America would do would just bomb from above.
There's not much else it can do.
Mm-hmm. Which would not really get them any progress anyway.
What you could do is you could continue to destroy until everything's broken and Iran is then non-functional. But Iran has friends that aren't keen to see that happen.
For example.
So if you think about China, China gets about 50% of its oil and its natural gas from Iran. It doesn't want to see any interruption to that flow.
But would it be worth them getting involved? Considering that if China gets involved, that just escalates the conflict to a different level.
Yeah, I don't think it's likely. I think if China worries that this is getting too big, it will force some type of settlement
through diplomacy
on the situation. Likewise with Russia. You know,
it's sad because when you look at all of this, you just think there's going to be so much bloodshed, so much destruction to infrastructure. But ultimately, they're all just going to sit down on the table. They're going to have to sit down. It just seems like all plausible outcomes lead to, you're going to have to sit down, you know, through intermediaries or whatever have it, and sign some type of deal. So why not just do that now?
Yeah. What would that deal involve? If it were to be signed now, it could involve Iran agreeing that it won't enrich above a certain threshold, and it will.
Wasn't that already the agreement they had?
That was the agreement. So it would be like going back to an earlier state.
Yeah.
Israel clearly finds that unsatisfactory. America would find that unsatisfactory. It could be that, for example, Russia says, well, we'll provide enriched uranium to a certain level for their peaceful nuclear program.
Yeah.
Russia is already operating Iran's only nuclear reactor that contributes to the national electric grid.
Mm-hmm.
And that's up quite close on the coast of Iran towards Kuwait.
Mm-hmm.
And already Putin is saying to Israel,
don't touch it.
You may not touch it.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think Israel is stupid enough to do that. Israel, it is aware of the dangers to its own interests. I don't think it's likely to want to antagonize Russia. And so I think that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's going to be a strike on that reactor. And it does demonstrably produce nuclear generated electricity
mm-hmm.
that's plugged into the national grid. It's hard to understand, to go back to your start point, how the world works. And in the absence of not knowing, people will easily fall prey to conspiracy theories. Mm. You mentioned the Illuminati. Is the world governed by someone? If it is, they must be pretty incompetent, because the world is far less functional mm-hmm. than it could be to serve mm-hmm. anyone's interest. It's far more competitive and divided and adversarial than it should be. So if there is a controlling, dark room where people are sitting around mm-hmm. a board table with maps and deciding the future of the world, they're not very good at it.
Not very good at it. I think the fact that all these superpowers are competing with each other just exposes that it is not the case. It just shows it's just these are just humans behaving like humans.
I think, though, there are things that need to perhaps change. The Charter of the United Nations was created while the Second World War was still going, mm-hmm. and it gave preference and political power to the allied nations. And so if you look at the Security Council of the United Nations and its 5 permanent members, you see Britain and Russia, which used to be the Soviet Union, and America.
So Russia is still part of the
Security Council.
What is the Security Council? Sorry,
So there's 2 councils within the United Nations. One's called the General Assembly, and that's where 195 states are equally represented. They all get 1 vote each on every issue. So it doesn't matter whether you're a country like India, which has more than 1.3 billion humans, or a country like New Zealand, which has 5 million. You get 1 vote in the General Assembly. They vote on lots of things. They don't vote on the highest security issues in the world.
Okay.
That's decided by the Security Council.
Okay.
And that has 5 permanent members. And then it brings in every year 10 more members that are chosen by rotation. Non-permanent members. So that there's a council of 15, of which the victors of the Second World War, no, not the victors, but the allies of the Second World War are the 5 permanents.
Okay.
So you've got China, and that seems representative, as 1.3 or 1.5 billion Chinese.
China was an ally?
In the Second World War, it was. Got defeated by the Japanese and suffered horrendous occupation, as France did, which is also on a permanent member of the Security Council. It wasn't a victor nation. China and France were both effectively defeated. But the 3 victor nations, which was America and Britain and Russia, have those other 2 allies from the Second World War as the permanent members of the Security Council. They decide pretty much everything through what's called a veto. And so let's say that 4 members of the Security Council say Israel's occupation of Gaza must end. Well, Israel's closest ally is the United States, which has a veto power on the Security Council. It just simply says we veto. And the decision, which is called a resolution in the Security Council, has to involve all 5 in agreement and 4 others. So a total of 9 have to have an affirmative, unanimous agreement. And if one of the 5 permanent members says no, that's it. It's over.
Okay.
So that needs revisiting, that whole issue. And it's been like that since 1945. And it's non-representative. And because you've got 2 of the world's, or now 3 of the world's strong powers, you've got America and you've got China and you've got Russia, all represented with very different global interests. It means there's no likelihood of agreement on a lot of key issues that come before the Security Council.
Isn't it like America and Russia, obviously not the best of friends?
Strangely, with President Trump and President Putin, they're not the worst of enemies at the moment.
Yeah.
And I've thought a lot about that. I think you like when you see something of yourself in someone else. And autocratic leaders seem to like each other. And so it's a strange thing that President Putin talks to Trump. And Trump boasts he doesn't talk to Macron in France or Keir Starmer in Britain. He talks to me. And it's just they're more similar than you would actually imagine.
Yeah.
I think Putin is the cleverer. He's a highly astute politician. He's survived in power for 2.5 decades and transformed the fortunes of Russia. When he took over from Boris Yeltsin, Russia was a broken mess of a country and pretty much impoverished. It is now genuinely a strong country again and pretty united country. And by saying united, I don't mean there's not dissent. Of course there is. But there seems to be, for example, in terms of even the Ukraine war, something of a consensus in Russia that we're behind the president on this one. And there's little that can be done, I think, to interfere with the mindset of the Russians on that. They just seem to get it. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the nature of war that wars tend to unite a people rather than divide them.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, the worse it gets for you, the more united you become against the common foe. And so, and I think Trump sees in Putin something of himself, and perhaps wishes he were as politically skilled and astute as Putin.
Really?
Trump probably isn't, but Putin is really smart. And Xi in China, again, he's held power for a long time. He's not an autocrat in the model of a Putin or a Trump in that sense of believing that I alone can make decisions. I don't have to go to Congress, or I don't have to go here or there. He's not like that. But he's undoubtedly a strong man. And so we have a world dominated by those three strong men at the moment, Putin, Trump, and the Chinese premier.
Xi Jinping.
And they're all kind of, in some ways, similar. And I'm not making a moral judgment. Arabs throughout their history have liked strong leaders as well, and identified with masculine traits of leadership and personal power projection and so on. But those three at the moment are entirely dominating global affairs. And the old traditional powers, like old Europe, really have no say in anything anymore. They're just mostly ignored. You know, I think Trump finds Macron in particular, the French leader, to be just annoying.
And why do you think that is?
Well, because he is annoying. You know, Macron he doesn't seem to have a fixed moral compass or an identifiable set of policies. He flip-flops. He changes his mind on lots of things. Hard to know what he stands for except his own survival.
How is he still in power?
Because there's no one else in France
really
at the moment. They have a cluster of parties based around what used to be called the National Front, and this is Marine Le Pen's party in France. And they aren't strong enough in themselves to form a viable government, at least yet. And countries where they have to build coalitions, like Israel and Italy and other countries, France, they've separated out, actually, as America has, away from the center ground. And when I was a boy, I mean, I'm an old man, I'm 61 years old now, but when I was a boy, the politics of the world was broadly sitting in the center, at least outside of the Warsaw Pact. There wasn't a far right and there wasn't a far left outside of the Warsaw Pact. Mostly everybody was clustered towards the center. That center has effectively disappeared. And now politics is polarized into what's quite an extreme right and what's quite an extreme left. And I'm a bit shocked by that. You know, you'll see what used to be the old Marxists of the 1970s and 80s. When the Cold War ended, there was a kind of a philosophical slippage, if that's the right word, for those Marxists into what we now call identity politics and the politics of decolonization and so on, gender politics. All of those have been picked up by what used to be the old Marxists. And in fact, the first authors of what we now call postmodernism, who ushered in this wave of postmodernity, had indeed been former Marxists or communists.
Okay.
And so it comes from that movement. When that began to die, all those people moved their focus away from economics, which is what the dominant idea within communism, onto ideas about power and control. And so the narrative that the old traditional empires had dominated through colonial exploitation, the rest of the world, has become the dominant narrative. And it's not surprising. I mean, there's some truth in that. But by the 1940s, most of the world had abandoned colonies, abandoned empire. But philosophically, it led to this kind of feeling that the systems and the institutions of old Europe and the West, are by nature exploitation. They're inherently exploitative, inherently racist, which is, in my view, probably not a sustainable position. And then, as we've had this march towards increased human rights, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War, which isn't focused on states and their rights. It's focused on what you have as an individual within yourself, what rights are inalienable to you, what the Americans once called life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Human Rights went even further and talked about things like slavery, that no person should live as a slave, the freedom of religious confession, and those sorts of things were enshrined. And what that did was it focused far more attention than ever on what a person is within themselves, as opposed to what they were as part of a wider group, let's call it society. And so the dominant philosophical approach now is focused on the individual. And that corresponds with this postmodern view that there's no objective truth, and that the objective truths that did exist were, in fact, part and parcel of colonialism or imperialism and should be abandoned. That truth is whatever subjectively you say it is. And so you'll get somebody who will say, I know I am this, and I therefore identify as that. And if you are to challenge me, it must be because you hate me. And it must be because you're holding on to things that are by nature racist or colonial or imperialist. And you've formed a view on me because of that. And so we're in this dangerous time in history where we went from pre-modernity, which was a kind of a belief that gods, whichever gods, plotted the course of human history and determined the fate of human activities, to the modern world, from Copernicus through to now broadly, where we began to look at objectivity as a requirement and say truth is established through evidence and through objective inquiry. We're now thrown that out as well, and we've moved into what they call the post-truth world, where subjectivity, the intensity of personal feeling, is now the determiner of truth.
Okay, I know you're here for the podcast, but I need to share something that's been happening behind the scenes with you. So, being in the position that I'm in, I get exposed to a lot of opportunities that most people would live and die never be exposed to. I obviously can't make use of all these opportunities. And in those situations, it just makes sense to share it with you. There is a brother who's helping brothers who have zero business experience start making money online. Within 90 days, the overwhelming majority of his students will start making money. He's got a student that secured a $48,000 deal within just 60 days. His students are making $10K a month. This is ridiculous because he's literally taking guys from zero to hero with Allah's permission. Now, I'm sure you've heard these type of claims before. And so have I, which is why I didn't really buy it until my previous sales director, my head of sales, came to me and said, listen, bro, this guy's program is different. Like, people are making money. Like, people when they join this program are not saying I was inspired. They're not saying I was motivated. They're saying I made bread with Allah's permission. So naturally, I had to get in touch with him. And I asked him, I said, Akhi, how do you do it? And he said, the process is simple. I help Muslims become solopreneurs, where I get them to secure deals between brands and influencers. I show them how to structure the deal and make the cut in between. And I show them how to do it in a way that's halal. I have never seen someone whose program has got such a high success rate. And it makes sense. Why? Because this is not like a course that you're just going through. This is a hands-on mentorship. This is feedback loops. This is a very hands-on program. Now, with these things, there's always a catch. And the catch here is that it's very hard to get inside this program. They've had well over 10,000 applications and less than 2% have been considered. And more than 98% of those applications have been rejected. Now, I'd love to tell you that this is just like a scarcity tactic, but no, genuinely, like they are so obsessive about the type of people that they let through because they want to make sure they safeguard their success rate. So they want to make sure that you're actually qualified for the program. So look, if you're ready to stop watching others win and actually start winning yourself, and you've been looking for that golden opportunity, you can apply to join Brother Abu Lahya's marketing influencer mentorship at the link below. It's real. And inshallah, it could be that break that you've been waiting for, man. With that said, let's get back into the podcast. So is this like adopted in at a government level?
Well,
or is this just like a fad that society is going to?
I don't think it's a fad. I think it's been picked up, but for example, by schools and universities.
Mm-hmm.
So now children are educated with that philosophy taught to them.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't just a matter of human rights. It isn't just, Johnny, be the best you can be.
Mm-hmm.
You have the right to determine what you want to be in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Go for it. It's far more than that now. It's to the point where if, let's say, a child declares himself a cat
or a dog,
then the school system says you have the right to be a cat or a dog,
mm-hmm.
and we'll protect your right. And if anyone denies that you're a cat or a dog, there'll be consequences for them.
Professor, it seems like there's been a pretty strong pushback, though, in the last 2 years or so with regards to this this ideology. If you look at it in terms of America specifically, the liberals and the Democrats have just gone to two complete different ends of the spectrum here.
Yeah, I think so. You know, there aren't many places in the world now where, for example, you'll get puberty blockers at the age of
mm-hmm.
10, which was happening. But the identity politics, and indigenous rights, and I'm all for it. I come from a country, I was born in New Zealand, which was part of a colonial experiment. I saw what happened to the rights of indigenous and how they were dramatically minimized, and I saw the consequence of that on their mental and physical health. Just outrageous. The theft of land and so on. I understand that. I understand it completely. But that's something separate. Decolonization does have positive aspects to create a kind of a restitution or a compensation to people
mm-hmm.
who lost out during the last days of empire. But the other parts of post-modernity are distressing to me. I'm a scholar. I grew up with a method that enabled me to make statements that I could demonstrate were true,
mm-hmm.
based on evidence and on reason. And now I'm told that those ideas about evidence and reason actually don't matter too much. That, well, you may say that, but my truth is this.
And I presume you can actually get attacked and penalized for even mentioning, your beliefs here.
Yeah.
If it opposes what these guys are saying. Do you think this ideology has weakened America? Because we can see on a global scale, it doesn't appear at least to be as powerful as it once appeared to be. It's got a lot more challenges now.
I think so.
And there's like a degree of confidence that's been lost with regards to the strength of America as a global player. No doubt it's still, probably the superpower of the world.
I think its days are over. I think that the 20th century was considered to be the American century.
Mm-hmm.
Its dominance was so vast. At one point it effectively controlled something like, 65% of global trade. Its military power was almost immeasurable. It was so great. And it was cohesive. The Americans after the Second World War were socially cohesive. But what's happened is that individualism and the focus on the individual as opposed to the collective society, let's call it society, where does loyalty lie now? Loyalty lies to myself now. I'm loyal to me, as opposed to I'm loyal to my country or to my flag. Last week, President Trump put up a very large flagpole. He's just been to the UAE, I think, where he's seen great flagpoles. He's gone back and thought, flags matter. And actually, they do matter. They are a symbol of a country. And the very act of putting up a flagpole in front of the White House with this great flag has caused enormous divisions and problems. So society is divided.
They've become divided over it?
Yeah.
They're very patriotic people. What would be their issue?
But that's the thing, isn't it? You see, patriotism is an old-fashioned colonial idea, or at least from the days of empire, where patriotism and nationalism were seen as positive. But with this enormous focus on individualism, what do those concepts mean now?
So they were offended by their flag being erected?
Yeah, the flag is a divisive thing in America.
I had no idea. I thought, as in the impression I had of America, I mean, I haven't been to America in over 10 years, but there's a flag hanging out of, everyone's window. Yeah.
Well, and for some people there is.
But there are some that just demonstrates the lack of loyalty people have to their country now.
But that's the point I'm making, you see, is that once it was, let's take New Zealanders in the First World War. New Zealanders went off to the First World War thinking this is something that we have to do as citizens. And they died in quite large numbers. Second World War comes around and they do the same thing again.
Okay.
They think that the state, the country, our society has value, and the value has to be protected. And you might call that nationalism, and nationalism is now seen as inherently negative. But when you recast it as patriotism, it should have a more positive color. Patriotism is loaded with the sense of selflessness, devotion to others, the willingness to serve your nation. This great emphasis on the individual is pushing that away. And so in America, people have been, until recently, less willing to serve in the military than they had been before. And even recruitment was becoming difficult.
And would you say that the main factor behind this is the postmodern ideology?
I think so. And again, I'm not a defender of imperialism or colonialism. God forbid. There were enormous problems and damage caused. But we've swung so far, the pendulum has swung so far in this polarized world that patriotism doesn't mean anything anymore.
So what do you think America's future is then, over the next?
Well, America is getting supplanted as the world power by China. I mean, that's a fact. Its GDP is as big as America's, and its influence. So you have two components to play with as a state in the world. You have power and you have influence. And you take a little country like New Zealand, it doesn't have any power. It's rich and prosperous. If you live there, you have a wonderful life. But it has no power in the sense that it can't impose its will upon anybody. Even the small Pacific islands around it, New Zealand has to use persuasion and influence with. So it's focused away from the projection of power. Well, actually never did. But it's one of those countries that says power isn't what we're about. We're about influence, which means we seek out partners that believe broadly the same things as we do and share the same values as we have. And we'll try and represent ourselves well enough on the international stage that people will say, those New Zealanders are good arbiters or moderate mediators in disputes or things like that. Or there's power. And broadly the world, in terms of international relations theory, political theory, has separated the world into countries that are what they call realist and those they call liberal. And liberal doesn't mean that the state has liberal values that are about personal choices. It means that influence on the international stage is preferred over power. But realists...
those are liberals.
Yeah. The realists are those, like America's the traditional realist country, where it says that the world is competitive and not necessarily cooperative at all. The liberals will say the world is cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
We just have to find the right partners on the right issues. And it's all about partnership building and about a consensus of ideas, like democracy.
I see. So this is the thesis behind Professor John Mearsheimer's The Tragedy of Great Power Politics.
Exactly.
I think Professor Jeffrey Sachs, then he would be the economist. He would be a liberalistic, because
Jeffrey
he
Sachs
believes through having like good trade relationships and whatnot, we can thrive and
that's right,
be prosperous and don't need to to wars.
But the problem with realists is that it's about what's called maximization of power.
Uh-huh.
How do we strengthen our power effectively at the cost of others?
Uh-huh.
You see, if we go up, it's important that they go down.
Mm-hmm.
We can't all go up together.
Yeah,
there's not enough stuff to go around, including power. So what a realist country does is it seeks to maximize power, sometimes with the goal of hegemony,
mm-hmm.
which is like regional power and control.
Mm-hmm.
But power is the dominant kind of discourse
mm-hmm.
with realist states. And America is a traditional realist power. And for the last 100 years, it's had great success with that.
Mm-hmm.
Strangely enough, despite its military strength, enormous military strength, the pursuit of power sometimes led it to poor conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
You think about taking a position on Vietnam
mm-hmm.
in the 1950s and then through the 60s into the early 70s. America truly believed that power could bring change in Vietnam, and found, in fact, that the contest of ideologies was one it couldn't win. And America lost the Vietnam War. America found itself in a contest against the traditional realist Middle Eastern state of Iraq that had far less power. And it was something of a walkover with Gulf War I. But then it got into these situations where power alone couldn't bring results.
Mm-hmm.
So Afghanistan 2001 and Iraq 2003, and it got itself bogged down in those wars. It spent trillions and tens of thousands of lives on one side, hundreds of thousands of lives at least on the other side, and couldn't win either. And withdrew first from Iraq and eventually withdrew from Afghanistan, leaving in place the very people that it had been fighting and considered enemies. So I think the American century is well and truly over. And despite its so-called pivot to Asia, I think the rise of China is unstoppable. India has, I think, too many internal problems to allow it to grow at the same rate as China. So I think the next 100 years is likely to be the Chinese century.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about the part of the world that I was born in, the South Pacific, you see the Chinese in the Cook Islands and in other island groups through the Pacific, spreading influence, not power. They'll simply say to the Cook Islands, we'd love to invest in your economy. Your economy isn't as strong as it could be.
Like they're doing in Africa.
Mm-hmm. And so it's doing this all over. Horn of Africa, Pacific, the Central Asia.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese now are extending their influence everywhere. And it is influence. It's not power. It's not power projection in a traditional sense of just creating bases and putting troops and aircraft and warships there. They simply say, well, we'd like to invest in this economic sector in your country. We're going to give you this, no strings attached. And if you're a poor island group, like the Cook Islands, which traditionally used to have strong relationships with New Zealand and also with Australia, it's very tempting to say to the Chinese, that's wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And the Chinese in time are able to say, well, look, we'd like to bring our goodwill fleet here, but we'll need harbour infrastructure. How would it be? You don't have to pay for it. We'll pay for it.
As a military fleet.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what New Zealand and Australia are now worried about. They're thinking, well, we've lost our place in the pecking order in the Pacific, and China has taken it. And it hasn't taken it through force. It hasn't taken it through traditional power projection. So the world is changing.
If China is to rise as the primary superpower in this century, would America go down without a fight? Like, what would be your prediction there? Like,
well, it's hard to say. If you take, I don't know, the year 1900 to 1920, or even 30, Britain was in the position of hegemon. It had its empire, very large empire, one of history's greatest. After the Second World War, it was essentially bankrupt. It was paying lend-lease repayments to America alone of tens of billions. In today's money, trillions. It couldn't hold the empire, and it gradually realized it couldn't and abandoned it and slipped from being what once we would have seen as a superpower to being a middle power. Will America slip to being a middle power? Not immediately, but it will slip down the pecking order from number one to eventually number 2 or 3 or 4. That just seems to be the likely way things will happen.
Who do you think could be the number 2s and 3s and 4s in the next century?
Well,
if America was to slip,
I've always predicted the rise of Brazil, and it's happening slower than I had thought. I remember when I first started as a young lecturer, assistant professor, I used to teach international relations classes where I said, you wait and see Brazil in a decade. That hasn't happened quickly yet, but Brazil is geographically an immensely large country.
Massive.
It's about a third of all of South America is Brazil alone. And it has a very large military and a large economy, has lots of natural resources, including offshore oil and gas. I think Brazil is going to find its feet and do better. India, India has a lot of internal issues to deal with. Its population doesn't compare, for example, in terms of healthcare and life expectancy and education to China. On all measures, China is far ahead. But we shouldn't write off India. India is still, at the moment, it's a growing economy, and it's either first or second equal largest country in terms of population. It's got as many people as China. And beyond that, Russia's in decline. Russia has declined not just for 40 years, but making good the loss of manpower in the Second World War. This was the beginning of Russia's slip downwards, I think. Putin's trying to reverse that. He doesn't want a return to the Soviet empire or even a return to any empire. But he does hold out hopes that Russia can do better than it is.
Okay.
And to do that, he's appealing to the kind of patriotism and nationalism that the rest of the world is abandoning, as I mentioned. When I used to go to Russia, when I started going to Russia for the first time, there were occasional statues of Stalin or Lenin, particularly Stalin. And the cult of Stalin is now growing again with Putin's full support in Russia. He wants to remind the people that they defeated the Nazis, not the Western allies. They did. And it cost them 20 million of their citizens to do it, the ultimate sacrifice. And so by identifying himself in some ways with Stalin, he's saying to them, look, I want that sense of greatness back for us. We do need to be a respected people again.
Do you think that's plausible? Or do you think its decline is inevitable?
Its population's about double the size of Britain's, even though its land mass is about 25 or 30 times bigger. And its population is shrinking. And that's a problem. But bringing Russia has what's called the Commonwealth of Independent States. And that Russian Federation that sits at the heart of that, I think wants more unity amongst those countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union that have good relations with Russia. I think Russia would like to build something amongst that group of states. So you have a lot of states like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan and others. And he's courting them actively. And he's smart. Putin is hitching his wagon to China increasingly. And his relationship to the Chinese government is very positive. The two leaders are terribly, terribly close friends. They had the 85th May Day parade last month in the Kremlin, in Red Square in Moscow. And Xi and Putin sat together talking intimately as very close friends throughout it. And I watched that and I thought, once we would have seen China as second fiddle to the Russian leader and pandering, and now in some ways it's Putin pandering to China. But it's a good relationship, and it's one that I think President Trump wishes he had with either of them. He's the third one out. You see, he's the other two that are like that, and he's the third strong man who hasn't got anyone. And if he could have pulled Putin away, I think he would have liked to have. And it's still not impossible that he courts Putin. The fact that he was willing to say publicly, Trump, Crimea should, of course, it's part of Russia. That's a given. Ukraine has to get over the loss of land, accept what it's lost and move on, which was his position on this. That must have been music to Putin's ears, obviously. But Putin has kept himself a bit aloof from Trump. Trump went courting, and Putin didn't respond, with the holding hands that they thought would occur. So,
what do you think? With this region, do you think it has prospects to become a
like a world hub? Yeah, I think so. The United Arab Emirates, in particular, is a very smart country in that it's taken a position of kind of universal engagement and a kind of a neutral position on the tensions between the greater powers. So, for example, China and India are tremendous rivals. And the UAE has kept the warmest relations with both. And likewise with Russia and America, Putin sees this country and this region very favorably. And so does the United States. So people are seeing a concentration of prosperity happening in the Gulf. The Gulf economies are strong and stable, and that's enviable to other parts of the world. it hasn't cost these countries terribly much. Really, it hasn't. Interestingly, the UAE's relations with Iran haven't been better. Even Saudi and Iran have been far warmer than ever. And so I see if Iran can survive this and stability returns to Iran, a return to those kinds of healthy relationships. Tourism is becoming immensely important to Saudi Arabia. They see it. I think they've looked at the UAE in particular, but to Qatar as well to a degree, Bahrain, and thought, what percentage of GDP are they generating from tourism? And why aren't we? And it meant there has to be some kind of philosophical approach or change within Saudi that they've been willing to make. I remember going once to Mada'in Salah to see the Nabatean ruins. You know, the Petra in Jordan was one of the capitals of Nabatea, and the other in that Midian area of Saudi Arabia have almost identical ruins. You look at photographs, you'll think it's Petra because it was the same nation, same civilization. When I went there, there were 3 people in Mada'in Salah the day I went. And we parked our car right next to the ruins. We walked around. We saw 3 other people that day. Now there's between 7,000 and 10,000 people a day in Mada'in Salah. And that whole Al-Ula region in northern Saudi Arabia from Tabuk, around that area, most people there now are tourists and not locals. You go and they're greatly outnumbered by tourists. And that happened quickly. In the time that I've lived here, I've lived in this region for 14 years. I've gone from a time when there were no tourists and the only kinds of people would be the more adventurous Muslims who had done their Hajj or Umrah, who wanted to go up and see Tabuk because of the association with our beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And you saw no other tourists. Now tourists outnumber the locals greatly and bringing in a fortune in revenue. And I couldn't have imagined that, but I see it happening. And it's probably a good thing.
In all of this, Professor, what do you think is to come of Israel if America, its strongest ally, falls into decline? And
it's really difficult. I have a lot of Muslim friends that wish for the extinction of Israel. They're not genocidal. They don't want the citizens killed. They just want that state somehow gone. And I say to them, how do you unmake a state? How does that happen? What's the process? Give me a historical example of how to uncreate something that exists. How do you do that? And there's no easy answer. My view is that unless there's some kind of change, Israel will survive and Palestine won't. The settlements in the West Bank are, and I've been there many times, it is now non-contiguous. It's hard to find, even in the West Bank, Palestinian lands that join Palestinian lands that all intersected by non-Palestinian or non-Arab settlements. And the settlements are popping up at a very quick rate. And Gaza, I think, is non-viable for the Palestinians now. In the Second World War, I mentioned this to you in our previous meeting, the British Empire and the Americans bombed the German cities and the Japanese. We destroyed 50 German cities. We flattened them to the ground and just left them in ruins. When I look at photographs of Gaza today, I can't tell that's not Hamburg or Dresden in 1943 or 1945. It's just gone. It's just flattened. And I think it's non-viable. So what happens to Palestine? The answer is, I don't know. God bless the Palestinians. We hope for the best for them. As Muslims, we know that when there's part of the Islamic Ummah hurting, the whole Ummah is hurting. But what's the future of it? I'm pessimistic at the moment and not optimistic for Palestine. Israel, I don't know how it's ever unmade. And making state, making Israel actually wasn't too hard.
Mm-hmm.
You had the movement of particularly European Jews through the first half of the 20th century to the point where they became numerous and strong. And then that brand new United Nations, by vote, simply said, let's give the Jews a homeland. And it happened quickly. And it's been there since 1948. My hope would be that at some point there's a realization that one has to live with neighbors and one has to live with minorities. And in that sense, I've always favored a one-state solution where whatever that state is called, Jews and Muslims and Christians and others could live without hatred and without superiority and kind of a class and racial hierarchy. People are just people and live together and get on together. Am I optimistic about that as well? No, I'm not. But again, perhaps as America declines, if I'm right, and it is declining, that safety net that Israel's had might change, and it might force through pragmatism a kind of a reawakening of thought on how Israel will go forward. I'm not sure. It's undoubtedly an issue that has to be addressed by the Israelis too. I think some type of realization from within is the best way forward. But how's that going to happen? But to go back to the place we started from, Israel can't have wars perennially. It can't constantly be at war. And it's done a whole lot of war in recent decades, and in particular in recent years, that has drawn a lot of attention to it, and a lot of negative attention, where people are saying, is this country exempt from the norms, for example, of international law, and the norms expected of someone in that global community of nations? And the Israeli people won't want that. They won't want to become a pariah. And at least in the Islamic world, they are already seen as a pariah. And with exceptions, there are some countries that have taken a slightly different view. What do you think?
What makes me optimistic is that when you go back to, it's actually interesting because this is in a passage in the Quran when Prophet Moses is speaking with the children of Israel. At the time they're being persecuted by Fir'aun. He said, Allah says in the Quran that وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, that the final outcome will be in favor of those who fear Allah. So that verse gives me a lot of hope. Allah says in another place in the Quran, وَمَن يَتَّقِ وَيَصْبِرْ, whoever لا يضركم كيدهم شيئا إن تصبروا وتتقوا لا يضركم كيدهم شيئا. If you are patient and you fear Allah, ultimately their plotting and their planning will not harm you.
I think that's true. I think that's the thing as Muslims that we have to take comfort in, is that ultimately God wants a world in which good defeats evil and prevails. And so that's why I think the answer actually isn't some type of change from without, but a philosophical change from within that we have to hope for, where Israel will be a state like others and not exempting itself from the norms of the world. It's a really tough one. I don't know.
It's a complicated world, but as you mentioned, having a merciful Lord who is all wise and all knowing is the thing that gives us optimism for a bright future. Ultimately, Professor, thank you so much for your time. We've unfortunately run out of time. We could have carried on having spoken for at least another hour, but our studio time has run out. I really appreciate you taking your time out to make that journey all the way from Abu Dhabi to here. And I'm truly indebted to you and very grateful for your time.
It's been my great pleasure. I mean, it's a terrible time to be speaking together where we see such suffering. And I really, truly extend my hopes and prayers for the civilians on both sides of these conflicts. It's the civilians that haven't done what their governments are doing. And as I mentioned, it's the nature of war today that they suffer most. And so I'd like to close with that hope that we see a move away as we go forward through the next decades, away from this awful ratio where the overwhelming majority of people hurt in war, killed in war, suffering, displaced, are the civilians. Inshallah.
I mean, and with that said, thank you so much for your time and ending it on that lovely note. And I have to say, Professor, thank you. You know, I just really admire the way you hold yourself to this higher moral standard, and it's exactly what we should be doing as Muslims.
Inshallah.
And it's hopefully those that have bad thoughts about us or misunderstand us can be exposed to this type of material and then start to see this is the reality of Islam.
It is the reality of Islam.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Guys, with that said, we'll see you next week for another episode. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.